Here's a little sex ed you wish you had. Did you know that approximately 20% of women and 10% of men report experiencing sexual shame? Sexual shame is the feeling or belief that you are inherently bad or wrong as it relates to sex or your sexuality. So believing that your desires are wrong, things of that sort. When sexual shame shows up, it can hijack pleasure, hijack intimacy, hijack your entire relationship if you're not careful, which is why it's so important to me to have these conversations and to let folks know that one, sexual shame exists. Two, it's not entirely your fault. We have had a lot of influences that contribute to feelings of sexual shame. And three, be forever. You can be free from sexual shame. You can experience liberation and freedom in your sex life. And that is exactly what our episode is going to be about today. So that's it for Sex Ed You Wish You Had. Several episodes of season 2 From the Heartside Out have been dedicated to Women's History Month, and this episode is as well. I did not want this month to end without talking about women in sex, women in pleasure. For me, it really does start with the myth of good girl myth, if you will. But what is that? Historically, there has been this myth created that good girls are essentially three things. They are modest, which means that they avoid any type of overt or explicitly sexual expression. They are agreeable. So good girls prioritize getting along with everyone. They prioritize harmony. They say yes, even when they mean no. They prioritize getting along and not rocking the boats, not upsetting or disturbing or disappointing anyone. Good girls are also self-sacrificing. They put themselves last. They live a life in service or servitude to other people. Their needs don't matter. Their wants don't matter. They deny themselves in order to uplift others. Again, the good girl myth says that you must be modest, agreeable, and self-sacrificing in order to be a good girl, a good woman, a deserving woman. These expectations to be agreeable, modest, and self-sacrificing can really impact how women show up in every area of their life, in their relationships, in their career, in their understanding of individuals and what agency or economy or choice they have. It impacts everything if you have built your life around being the good girl, being the one who doesn't cause trouble, who doesn't get into trouble, who doesn't think that other girls do. She's not like other girls. She's different. She's set apart. She is the standard. She is the example. When women step outside, women who dare to step outside of this box, outside of this mold, to reject these expectations, are not always treated very well. There are names for those type of women. Women who are sexually free or sexually expressive, who are open, who don't feel the sense of shame, or who actively fight against that sense of shame. They're met with criticism. They're met sometimes with punishment, historically, with punishment for not being a good girl or a good enough girl. And so again, you see enough women suffer because of their desire to be free or their desires to be themselves. And for a lot of women, that can be the only deterrent that's needed to keep them in line, so to speak, to keep them trying to be and striving to be good girls. And so it can continue to perpetuate this myth or this idea of what womanhood is supposed to look like or supposed to feel like. And think about it for a moment, how this could show up in someone's relationship or in their sex life. If they are striving to be modest, agreeable, and self-sacrificing to the extreme, what does that look like? What does that look like for them? Maybe they don't feel comfortable expressing their sexuality at all in things that they say or things that they wear, even in the privacy of their own home. Because I don't want someone to think that you're immodest. Even if it's your partner, even if it's someone you know loves you, is my partner going to think of me differently if I tell them about this fantasy I have or this desire that I have? When you're trying so hard to be agreeable, again, taking it to the extreme, that may mean you say yes when you really mean no. That may mean you don't actually have agency or autonomy over your body when it comes to sex because this expectation that your answer should always be yes. You should always be ready and available to your partner for sex, even if you're not in the mood, even if you don't feel connected to them, even if you don't feel good or you're just not interested in sex at that moment. And then self-sacrificing, putting your own wants and needs last. You don't matter as much as your partner. You don't matter as much as other people. And so who cares what brings you pleasure? Who cares what you enjoy or what you're curious about? This isn't about you. This is about your partner's experience. It's about their pleasure. Your pleasure doesn't matter much at all. And so these can be really harmful ideas that people have ingrained in them from very young. Our society is structured in a lot of ways that upholds this good girl myth and these unreasonable and unhelpful expectations. We're conditioned by our culture in a lot of ways. If you think about the ways that women are represented in media, the women who are sweet and demure and nurturing and giving and emotionally selfless, they are rewarded, they are praised, they are upheld. The women who prioritize their own wants and needs, who are vocal, who advocate for themselves, who stand up for themselves, who have the audacity to say, I want things, I need things, I deserve things, and to pursue those things passionately, they're vilified. They're called all sorts of names. They're not praised for their leadership, and they're not praised for their confidence. There are so many attempts to tear them down. And again, what we see in media can have a huge impact on what we think of ourselves or what we aspire to, what we see as normal or typical or expected. There's the phenomenon of slut shaming, where women who are more sexually liberated, more sexually expressive, who maybe enjoy having sexual partners, who are open and honest about that, they're shamed. They're told, you're wrong, you're bad, you're dirty, you're disgusting, you're undeserving, you're not valuable, you're meaningless, you're worthless. All of these things as a way to try to deter other women from falling into this quote unquote trap and stepping away from that good girl myth. It just reinforces this idea that women who are sexually expressive are immoral in some way, or they're less than in some way. And then we also have phrases like boys will be boys, right? That excuses men and their sexual behaviors, their sexual misbehavior sometimes, while still upholding these strict and oftentimes unreasonable purity standard for women. Again, these things are so deeply ingrained in our culture and our society because patriarchy and misogyny are deeply ingrained in our culture and our society. So it makes sense if you're like, oh, I can't believe I've fallen into the trap of believing some of these things or acting in some of these ways. It makes sense that you have, honestly, because for many of us, it's what we've known, it's what we've seen. It's all that we've known. We may not have had healthy examples pushing back on that or combating that. We also have to be honest about the role that faith and religion can play in this. Many religious traditions promote modesty and sexual restraint as virtuous traits in women. Now, it's usually said or written that modesty and purity are supposed to apply to everyone, but in practice, a lot of times the standards, the expectations are way stricter for women than they are for men. Because again, boys will be boys. They're just being themselves. They're just figuring it out. They can't help themselves. Part of who they are and what they do. But girls are supposed to know better. They're supposed to be more mature. They're supposed to be more modest. They're supposed to be the gatekeepers of sexual activities. Men or boys, the way it's talked about often, they just can't help themselves. They can't resist. They're not strong enough. It's natural for them. It's their masculinity coming out if they're more sexually expressive or more sexually aggressive even. But for girls and women, you're supposed to be able to tame that, to restrain that, to uphold the standard for yourself and for male partners if you have male partners. Virginity is often used or framed as a measure of your worth, a measure of your morality. Are you a virgin? How long have you been a virgin? What does being a virgin mean? Where have you toed the line or crossed the line? And that being used as a measure of your worth or your value. What kind of mate or spouse are you going to be able to attract if you're not a virgin, if you're not pure, or if you're quote unquote used? Because again, for women, sex is taught and weaponized as something that damages or diminishes worth and value. Or at least that's what patriarchy would have you to. And while we're talking about these big societal ideas and messages and patterns, those things trickle down into your community. They trickle down into your family. They trickle down to an individual level. The overemphasis on modesty and purity as a measure of worth and value, those things infiltrate your parenting. They infiltrate the culture of your family. Are you creating or maintaining the culture of your family? What I often encounter when it comes to the influence of patriarchy on sex is that patriarchy tells you two things, tells women two things when it comes to sex. You can't do this and you have to do this. You can't do this and you have to do this. You don't get to experience pleasure. That's not for you. That's not what the girls do. But I'll have to do this because a good woman keeps her man happy. A good woman always says yes. A good wife always says yes. It's never too tired, never too busy, never too sick. None of those things. So you can't do this, but you also have to do this. You can't do this for your own pleasure, for your own enjoyment, but you have to do this in service to someone else. There's no room for agency. There's no room for freedom within that kind of mindset or mind frame. The good girl myth positions women as caretakers, nurturers, the moral gatekeepers, the ones responsible for maintaining modesty and purity. And because of that, it can contribute to sexual shame in multiple ways. For one, again, it's that you can't do this and you have to do this. So one, you can't do this. Desire is seen and treated as a negative thing. Women feel ashamed because they want to have sex, because they want to be sexual and express their sexuality. They can especially feel shamed if they realize that they desire sex more than their male partner does. That there must be something wrong with me, or there must be something wrong with him, there must be something wrong with our relationship. And then again, the you have to do this side takes away sexual agency and autonomy. Women can internalize this belief that sex is something I'm required to give, it's something I'm required to do, it's something that's done to me as opposed to with me, or a mutually enjoyable experience. So we see that conflict between, again, you can't do this, but you have to do this. And then the good girl myth takes things a little further and says we can essentially separate all women into two categories. You might have heard this as the Madonna whore complex or the Madonna whore dichotomy, which is simply says that women are either a Madonna, they are a good girl, they are pure, they are modest. These are the type of women that you want to marry, to the type of women that are going to raise your kids. They are modest, agreeable, they are self-sacrificing. They are the epitome of all of those things that patriarchy says women have to be. And then you have the whore. She's sexual, she's independent, she may be as loud, she's more expressive, she's assumed to be promiscuous. And all of these things mean that she is not as worthy, as valuable, as deserving as the good girl or as the Madonna. And this binary is really restricting for women because it doesn't allow room or space for women to be both sexual and emotional, for them to be, yes, nurturers and caretakers, and also assertive and passionate and driven and ambitious. It denies women the full expanse and the full span of their humanity, of who they are. I'm a firm believer that we have to know where we've been in order to fully understand where we are and to be intentional about where we're going or where we want to go. In order to fully reclaim pleasure, we need to understand the historical factors and forces that have shaped women's sexuality and our understanding of women's sexuality. If we go way back to ancient times or pre-modern times, so to speak, There were some societies, especially in places like Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt, that really valued female sexuality. They saw female sexuality as sacred. It was something to be praised, something to even be worshipped. We have goddesses of love and fertility that honored and demonstrated that reverence that existed for female sexuality. Now, in similar times, in different parts of the world, like ancient Rome or ancient Greece, women were treated more so as vessels for reproduction. They were baby making machines, basically. That was their purpose. And so if we think about it, in this part of the world, those messages begin to spread as folks from this part of the world begin to spread. As they were branching out and colonizing, they brought their ideas with them. Their ideas about sex and sexuality and women's place in the world came with them. This continued, especially as we saw the rise of Christianity and Christian doctrine in different places throughout the world, and noticed more restrictions on morality, especially when it came to women and sexuality. How women were expected to dress, how they were expected to behave, how they were expected to interact with men, those sorts of things. By the 1400s, women and female sexuality is being connected to witchcraft and sorcery, things that were outright condemned by religious institutions who, in a lot of places in the world, were the government leaders as well. So making this connection between women who were more sexual, women who were more sexually expressive or free, as, oh, they are also undermining the church's authority. They are going against our moral code. These women must be punished. They must be shamed. They must be murdered, so that we, one, get rid of these women and their influence, and hopefully, quote unquote, hopefully, stop their influence from spreading to other women, because you don't want to corrupt the good girls. The goal is to have more and more good girls. So we have to get rid of these negative influences. Now, that does not mean that women have just taken this abuse, taken this oppression lying down. No pun intended. They have fought back. We have fought back throughout all of history. Again, there have been communities of women who said, no, we know what we deserve, we know what we want, and we're going to stand up for that. There have been women who started movements and demands of women having more equality and more rights, including in terms of sex and sexuality. We can look back at the suffrage movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s, where women were advocating for all sorts of rights. Yes, the right to vote, but also the right to just be equal members of society. They were advocating for reproductive rights, access to birth control, recognizing that these options would give them more options in terms of how they live their lives, how they express themselves, challenging laws around marriage and property rights, all of these sorts of things. This continued. We saw more and more of this, especially as we get to the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, the introduction of birth control that allowed women greater control over their reproductive choices, getting to choose and having more influence over if they wanted to have children, when they wanted to have children, gave them more freedom and liberation to say, I can be sexual without the assumption that I want to be a parent or that I'm going to be a parent. I get more say over that. I get more control. This continued and still continues even to today. We've seen how the women's sexual liberation movement have expanded to include things like body positivity, getting rid of the shaming culture around bodies and women's sexuality, wanting to open up the conversations more and to say, hey, we're here. Yes, we are women. Yes, we are sexual and we matter. Our pleasure matters. Wanting to center women and their pleasure more in these conversations. So again, it's not like women have just said, okay, no problem, so to continue to put up with this. There has been a resistance. There has been pushback out of recognition that women are not inherently shameful. Their sexuality is not inherently shameful. And their pleasure deserves to be a part of the conversation. That women's pleasure matters just as much as men's pleasure does. Maybe you're listening or watching this and you're saying, okay, some of this is resonating with me. I do think I'm experiencing some sexual shame. I do think maybe I've given in or upheld this good girl myth in my life in some ways. I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want that to be my story. So how in the world do I do that? How do I undo the harm that's been done from these narratives or from the good girl myth? Do you ever feel guilty after sexual experiences? If you struggle with expressing your desires to your partner, or if you believe that pleasure, especially your pleasure, is selfish, wanting pleasure, pursuing pleasure is selfish and a thing that you shouldn't do. Or if you notice that you just feel really disconnected from your body, feel, I don't know my body, I don't know what I like, I don't know what I want, I don't know how to figure that out. This is for you. This conversation is for you. I'm going to give you some ideas, some ways, some steps to reclaim pleasure for yourself and to challenge that good girl myth, to put it to rest for you. The very first thing I'm going to encourage you to do is practice some self-exploration and awareness. Awareness of your thoughts, your feelings, and just awareness of your body, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it smells like, what it tastes like. Just knowing yourself for yourself, understanding how arousal and desire work, how those things work for you, what they look like for you. Shifting beyond this male-centered view of sex that so many of us were taught and have upheld because we didn't know better, we didn't know different, and so we did what we knew. Being mindful in your approach to getting to know yourself or getting to know your body. What I mean by that is maybe if you're in the shower, for example, your habit may be, I get in, I be clean, I get out. I'm not spending a lot of time thinking about the body that I'm washing. I'm just washing it because that's what I got to do. But what if you really just slowed down and took a mindful sensory approach to showering? What does the soap or the body wash that you use smell like? How would you describe it to someone who's never smelled it before, who's never smelled that scent before? How would you describe it? What does it feel like on your skin? What's the temperature of the water that's hitting your skin? How does that feel? What's the texture of your legs, of your arms, of your shoulder blade, of your neck, of behind your knee, of your big toe? Just really taking a curious approach to your body. I've worked with many women who feel a lot of shame around how their genitals look, or who would say, I couldn't pick my vulva out in a lineup. I don't know her like that. I can't really tell you what she looked like or feel like. I try not to think too much about it. I do what I got to do when I have to do it and I move on. What if you really took some time to get to know your vulva, to pull out a mirror and explore with your hands, explore with the mirror? What are things looking, feeling like? What is it like to be you and be in your body, and taking a really mindful approach to that? Meaning it's a judgment-free approach. This is what I feel. This is what I see. I don't have to make judgments about whether this is good or bad. Is this too big, too small, too wide, too thin? That's not what a mindful approach is. It's just making note of what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, and really focusing on the sensory information that you're getting. Once you have this attitude or mindset of curiosity and exploration and more intentional awareness, you might be ready to do some of that internal work of just rewriting those narratives that you've told yourself, that have been told to you, the things that you carry around and maybe haven't really questioned or challenged until now. I invite you to really sit with those things and unpack those things. What are some of the beliefs you have about yourself, about sex, about intimacy, about sexuality, about bodies, about pleasure, about women or womanhood that aren't necessarily helpful to you? What messages did you receive about sex as you were growing up? That could be things that were directly said to you, like when it's appropriate to have sex or who it's appropriate to have sex with. It may be things that you observed or heard or saw that maybe no one's directly said, hey, here's a rule for you to follow, but you noticed how other people were treated or talked about when certain situations happen. Those still count as messages that you received in your childhood. Thinking about or reflecting on, how does it feel for you when you prioritize your own pleasure? That might not just be sexual pleasure. How does it feel for you if you take a day off of work, not because you had a doctor's appointment or had to go out of town for something or someone else, but because you just wanted the rest, because you just wanted to enjoy the day? How do you feel? What do you say to yourself or about yourself when you buy yourself a treat or treat yourself in a way that feels quote unquote selfish based on what you've been told is expected of you? What would it look like if you were to fully embrace your desires without fear, without shame, without judgment? What would your life look like? What would your sex life look like if you were honest about what you like, what you don't like, what you're curious about? These are questions that you can ask yourself to challenge and start rewriting those internal narratives. So maybe you have some thoughts or beliefs like, I'm not supposed to want sex or I shouldn't want sex. Maybe you can challenge that and push back on that thought by telling yourself, my pleasure is valuable. My pleasure is important. Again, first we have to know what those thoughts or those beliefs are before we can effectively challenge them or push back on them. Once you're doing this internal work, it's time to translate some of that into interpersonal dynamics, into communication with others, especially with a partner. The goal, the idea is that you get to a place where you can say no without guilt and you can say yes without fear or shame. So sometimes you won't be in the mood for sex, and that's okay. So your no is safe and it's respected and it doesn't diminish you. It doesn't mean you're a terrible person or a terrible partner. And that when you want to say yes to sex, when you do say yes to sex, it doesn't mean that you've done a terrible, awful thing. It doesn't mean that you should be ashamed or that you're not good or you're not smart or you're not worthy. To say no without guilt and yes without fear or shame. Communicating, using I statements, being able to say, I like this, I don't like that, I enjoy when we do X, Y, Z. Something I encourage folks to do all the time. You can do it just for yourself. You can do it as a couple. It's up to you. But create your sex bucket list, your pleasure bucket list. What are some things that you're really curious about, really interested in, or things that just feel good or that you think you would enjoy? Again, you can do that by yourself, or it's a great conversation to have with a partner. What are our desires? What are our curiosities? What are our fantasies? I understand that for some folks, these ideas, these suggestions might be easier said than done. They may sound like, yeah, that sounds really good. That sounds really simple. But what if I get rejected? What if my partner doesn't like this version of me? What if my confidence gives way and I chicken out and I can't say the thing or do the thing? I want you to have grace and patience with yourself. You are rewiring, reprogramming yourself. That takes time, that takes work, that takes effort. You didn't just wake up one day saying, I'm going to give in to the good girl myth and let that take over my sex life. So you're not going to wake up tomorrow and say, okay, I'm ready to do a complete 180 and now my life and sex life looks 1000% different. It takes time. It's okay that this takes practice. It's okay that you may want the support of working with a therapist or a professional to help you practice or help you gain some of these skills. That's why we're here. That's why we exist, to help you create that you want in your life. I would encourage you to work towards a relationship. If you don't currently have a relationship like this, that makes room and makes space for mutual exploration and curiosity. A relationship that normalizes open, frequent, shame-free conversations about sex. Maybe we need to play a round of we listen and we don't judge sex edition to be able to be open and honest and maybe in a carefree or lighthearted way about here are my desires, here are my curiosities, here are my questions, my fears, my concerns, all those sorts of things. I encourage you to create a relationship that prioritizes pleasure equity, that recognizes that both people's pleasure, all people's pleasure matters. I thank you all so much for your time and attention as always. After listening to this episode, let me know what you think of the resources that I share. If there are other resources that you know of that maybe I forgot to mention or that I don't know about, Please share that as well. I love to read the comments. I love to get messages from folks and just to hear how you're enjoying the show and how the resources are helpful for you. Thank you for tuning in to From the Heartside Out, hosted by See the Sex Lady, produced by Christine Johnson of Pure Pod Vibes, and music by Rico the Artist. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something new, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review on your platform of choice. And don't forget to share with a friend so they can learn something too. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Please send any comments or questions to podcast@seethesexlady.com. That's podcast@CEEthesexlady.com. Until next time, keep loving, living, and leading from the heart side out.